The crack of a rifle split the silence of the high plains, a sound as sharp and final as a breaking bone. Dust and chaos erupted on the trail below the ridge, where Jacob Whitmore watched his hand resting on the worn stock of his own Winchester. The stagecoach, a lumbering beast of painted wood and leather, careened to a halt, its team of 6 horses screaming in a tangled panic. 4 riders, their faces obscured by grimy bandanas, swarmed the coach like buzzards on a fresh kill. Jacob flattened himself against the cold granite, his buckskins blending with the muted tones of the Montana wilderness. This was not his fight. 15 years in the mountains had taught him a simple, brutal creed: mind your own, survive your own. The world of men, their greed, their violence, their fleeting dramas, was a poison he had purged from his soul long ago. He was here for supplies, a necessary evil, a brief descent into the noise and stench of civilization, before returning to the clean, unforgiving silence of his valley. One of the outlaws dragged the driver from his perch and threw him to the ground. Another yanked open the coach door, his pistol aimed at the terrified faces within. Jacob's jaw tightened. He had seen this scene play out 100 times in his mind, a ghost from a life he had buried. But watching it now raw and real stirred something cold and ancient in his gut. He remained still, a predator observing a lesser conflict, his heart a stone in his chest. A woman's scream, thin and sharp, pierced the air. A passenger, a man in a dusty frock coat, was thrown from the coach, landing hard in the dirt. As he fell, a small leather satchel burst open, spilling its meager contents. Among the scattered items, something glinted in the harsh afternoon sun. Jacob's eyes trained to spot the slightest movement fixed on the object. A small silver locket. It lay in the red dust, insignificant to the outlaws, who were now focused on the strongbox. But to Jacob, it was a thunderclap. The scene below faded. The shouts and gunshots receded into a dull roar. He was no longer on a ridge in Montana. He was in a sun-drenched meadow in Colorado, the scent of wildflowers heavy in the air. A woman's laughter, warm and familiar, echoed around him. "Jacob, look what I found." Her name was a whisper of pain on the edge of his memory. He saw her hand, delicate and strong, holding a locket just like that one. He saw the worn engraving, the tiny clasp. He felt the phantom weight of a small child in his arms, her tiny hand reaching for the shiny object. "Pretty, Papa, pretty." The memory shattered as a gunshot, closer this time, ripped through the air. One of the outlaws was pistol-whipping the fallen passenger. Something inside Jacob, a part of him he thought had died and turned to dust with his wife and child, broke free. It was not heroism. It was not righteousness. It was a pure, cold rage, a fury at the world's relentless cruelty, at the way it savaged the innocent and trampled on memory. He moved with the fluid economy of a mountain cat. He didn't raise his rifle. That was too loud, too distant. This required something personal. He slid down the scree-covered slope, his moccasins making no sound. He circled behind the chaos, using the panicked horses as cover. The outlaw nearest to him was stuffing valuables into a saddlebag, his attention fixed on his loot. Jacob closed the distance in 3 silent strides. He didn't speak. He didn't warn. His hand shot out, grabbing the outlaw's gun arm and twisting. Bones snapped with a sickening crack. The man screamed, his pistol clattering to the ground. Before the scream had fully registered, Jacob drove the heel of his palm into the man's nose. There was a wet crunch, and the outlaw collapsed into the dust, a broken, moaning heap. The other 3 whirled around, their eyes wide with shock. Jacob scooped up the fallen pistol, its metal warm in his hand. He didn't aim it. He held it loosely, a clear message that this was not a standoff. This was an executioner's arrival. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were devoid of fear or mercy. They promised only pain. "Leave," Jacob said. His voice was a low rasp, rusty from disuse, yet it carried over the panicked whinnying of the horses. The leader, a big man with a cruel mouth, hesitated, his own pistol wavering. He saw not a farmer or a prospector, but something wild and untamed. He saw a man who had made peace with death and was willing to share it. The choice was simple: a few dollars from a strongbox or a final violent meeting with whatever abyss lived behind this stranger's eyes. He cursed, motioned to his men, and they scrambled onto their horses, dragging their injured companion with them. They galloped away, disappearing into the vast emptiness of the plains, leaving behind a wake of dust and terror. Silence descended, broken only by the whimpering of the injured passenger and the ragged breathing of the others. Jacob stood motionless, the pistol still in his hand, and the cold rage slowly receding, leaving behind the familiar hollow ache of grief. His gaze fell upon the locket still lying in the dust. He bent down, his calloused fingers closing around the cool silver. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. The worn engraving of a single looping E was seared into his memory. Eleanor, his wife's name, a ghost on his tongue. He closed his eyes, the fragmented memory returning, the laughter, the wildflowers, the tiny hand in his. The pain was as sharp and immediate as it had been 15 years ago. He pushed it down, burying it again in the cold, hard ground of his soul. He tucked the locket into his pouch, a relic of a pain he could not escape. He was a fool to have intervened, a fool to let the past claw its way back to the surface. He turned to leave his business here, done, ready to melt back into the wilderness that had been his only sanctuary. "Wait," a voice called from the coach. "Sir, please, thank you." Jacob didn't turn around. He simply raised a hand in a dismissive gesture and walked away, his long strides carrying him back toward the ridge, back toward the silence. The world of men held nothing for him but ghosts. He had supplies to get in Copper Creek, and then 40 miles of hard trail separated him from the only peace he had ever known, the quiet, lonely solitude of his mountain home. Copper Creek was less a town and more a stubborn scar on the face of the wilderness. It clung to the banks of a frozen silver creek, a cluster of buildings huddling together against the vast, indifferent expanse of the Montana Territory. Jacob guided his pack horse down the main street, his eyes taking in the familiar signs of decay and endurance. Splintered signs, their faded paint, a ghost of brighter days, groaned under the weight of an early winter snow. The window razors slicing down from the high peaks carried the scent of pine smoke, wet wool, and the faint metallic tang of desperation. He moved through the town like a phantom, his buckskins and long, unkempt hair marking him as an outsider, a mountain hermit tolerated for his prime pelts and the good money he spent twice a year. Townsfolk gave him a wide berth, and their gazes a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect. They saw a man who had turned his back on their world, and they couldn't decide if he was a madman or a prophet. Jacob preferred it that way. Anonymity was a fortress. He tied his horse outside Mackenzie's Mercantile, the animal's breath pluming in the frigid air. The boardwalk planks groaned under his weight, a hollow sound that echoed the emptiness inside him. Through the frost-laced window, he saw old Mackenzie arranging tins on a shelf, his movements slow and deliberate. Jacob's supply list was short salt, flour, coffee, ammunition, the essentials for a man who lived by the rifle and the trap. He was about to step inside when a flicker of movement across the street caught his eye. Behind the saloon, near a pile of discarded crates and refuse barrels, a figure was kneeling in the snow. At first, he thought it was a child searching for a lost toy. But as his gaze sharpened, he saw the impossible reality of it. It was a woman, and she was wearing a wedding dress. The fabric, once a pristine white, was now a tattered, mud-stained shroud. Her dark hair had escaped its pins, falling in tangled knots around a face that was all sharp angles and hollowed cheeks. She was sifting through the trash with a desperate, furtive energy, her fingers raw from the cold. She was like a wounded doe, cornered and starving, yet still possessed of a fragile, heartbreaking grace. The sight should have meant nothing to him. It was just another tragedy in a world built on them. But the image of the locket, its cold weight still palpable in his pouch, had left a crack in his armor. Compassion and emotion, he thought, long dead, stirred like a dormant serpent. He knew that kind of hunger, the gnawing emptiness that chewed away at pride, until nothing was left but the raw will to survive. He watched as she found a half-eaten apple, its flesh bruised and brown. She clutched it to her chest as if it were a jewel, her eyes closing for a moment in what looked like a prayer of desperate gratitude. The gesture hit him with the force of a physical blow. His own carefully constructed solitude suddenly felt like a coward's prison. He had planned to be gone by nightfall, back on the trail to the safety of his valley. But his feet, seemingly of their own accord, began to carry him across the muddy, frozen street. His shadow fell over her, and she looked up, her dark eyes wide with the primal alarm of a creature surprised at a kill. She scrambled to her feet, clutching the apple core protectively. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 25, but hardship had carved years onto her face. "Ma'am," Jacob said, his voice a low rumble. He kept his distance, his hands open and relaxed at his sides, the way he would approach a spooked horse. "I'm fine," she said, her voice a brittle whisper laced with a fierce pride that her circumstances could not extinguish. Just dropped something." Her educated cadence was a stark contrast to her surroundings. Jacob's gaze flickered from her hollow cheeks to the ruined dress. He knew a lie when he heard one. He told himself enough of them over the years. He decided to cut through the pretense. "Name's Jacob Whitmore. Don't mean any harm." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "You need help?" Her defensive posture wavered. Her eyes dropped to the tattered lace on her sleeve, to her mud-caked hands, to the undeniable evidence of her desperation scattered in the snow around her. When she looked up again, her pride had fractured, revealing the raw fear and exhaustion beneath. "My name is Sarah," she whispered. Jacob simply nodded. He pointed with his chin toward the Golden Creek Inn, its windows glowing with the promise of warmth and food. "Inn serves a decent stew. Let me buy you a meal?" She stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign tongue. Why the question was not a challenge, but a genuine soul-deep bewilderment. Jacob thought of the locket of his own history with hunger and loss. "Because I remember what hungry feels like," he said, the simple truth landing with more weight than any crafted explanation. "And because no one should have to eat out of the cold." Her composure finally broke. A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She swayed, a sudden wave of dizziness threatening to overwhelm her. Jacob stepped forward instinctively, his hand reaching out not to grab, but to steady her elbow. She didn't pull away. I can't pay you back," she said, the admission costing her the last of her pride. "Didn't ask you to," Jacob replied. She studied his face for a long moment, taking in the weathered lines etched by sun and sorrow, on the quiet intensity in his pale eyes, the patient way he stood, without crowding her. Whatever she saw there seemed to be enough. "All right," she said, her voice barely audible. "Thank you." As they walked toward the inn, Jacob felt the familiar weight of complication settling upon him. He had ridden into Copper Creek for supplies. But as he looked at the woman beside him, her head held high. Despite the ruin of her dress, he had a sinking feeling he was about to leave with far more than he had bargained for. He was leaving with a problem. And for the first time in 15 years, he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to run from it. The Golden Creek Inn smelled of roasted meat, stale beer, and damp wool. It was the smell of sanctuary. Martha Hennessy, the proprietor, a woman whose face was a roadmap of hard-won battles, looked up from behind the front desk as they entered. Her gray eyebrows rose in a silent question as her gaze took in the unlikely pair, the wild mountain man and the bride, who looked as though she'd been dragged through hell. Evening, Jacob. Martha said, her tone carefully neutral. She had always treated him fairly, a transaction of mutual respect. Wasn't expecting to see you again so soon. Evening, Martha. Storm's coming in. He gestured to Sarah, wondering if you might have a table for two. Martha's professional neutrality softened as her eyes settled on Sarah. She saw past the ruined dress to the woman shivering beneath it. Of course, she said, her voice warming with a maternal kindness that seemed to surprise even herself. Right this way. By the fire. She led them to a small secluded table in the corner, away from the prying eyes of the other diners. Jacob held the chair for Sarah, a gesture of forgotten courtliness that felt foreign and clumsy. She sank into it, leaning toward the crackling flames, as if they were the only thing holding her upright. Whatever's hottest, Jacob told Martha when she asked for their order, and plenty of it. As Martha bustled away, an awkward silence settled between them. The firelight played across Sarah's face, illuminating the fine bone structure and the exhaustion that lay like a shadow in the hollows of her eyes. She stared into the flames, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, a portrait of shattered dignity. You don't have to tell me anything, Jacob said quietly. But if you want to talk, I'm willing to listen. She was quiet for so long he thought she would refuse. When she finally spoke, her voice was a monotone stripped of all emotion. I was supposed to be married 3 days ago, to a man I had only known through letters. He sent for me from Philadelphia, paid my passage. She took a shuddering breath. When I arrived, he took one look at me, said I wasn't what he'd pictured, and left. He took the dowry my aunt had given me, everything I had in the world. Jacob felt a familiar cold anger tighten his jaw, but he said nothing, letting her story unfold in its own time. Martha returned with 2 steaming bowls of beef stew and a basket of fresh bread. She placed a bowl in front of Sarah with a gentle hand. You eat every last bite of that, dear, she said softly. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes at the simple kindness. She picked up her spoon with a trembling hand and took a small, hesitant bite, as if she couldn't trust the food to be real. Jacob ate slowly, watching as the warmth and nourishment began to work their magic. Color slowly returned to her cheeks, and the rigid line of her shoulders began to relax. They were halfway through their meal when the inn's door swung open, bringing a blast of cold air and the scent of expensive cigar smoke. A man strode in, stamping snow from his polished boots. He was tall and handsome in a way that spoke of wealth and unchecked confidence. His coat was tailored from fine wool, his hat made of beaver felt. Jacob recognized him instantly, Marcus Wheeler, the most powerful rancher in the valley, a man who owned more land, more cattle, and more politicians than anyone else in Copper Creek. Wheeler's gaze swept the room, an emperor surveying his domain. It passed over Jacob with dismissal, but then it landed on Sarah and it stopped. An expression of predatory interest flickered across his handsome features. He moved toward their table with the unhurried grace of a man who believed the world was his for the taking. Evening. Martha Wheeler said, his voice a smooth, charming baritone, but his eyes never left Sarah. He stopped beside their table, his presence looming and unwelcome. He removed his hat, revealing a head of thick, dark hair. Miss, he said, his smile perfectly crafted. I don't believe we've had the pleasure. I'm Marcus Wheeler. Sarah looked up, startled by the intrusion. Sarah Mitchell, she replied, her voice barely a whisper. Wheeler's gaze took in her worn dress, her vulnerable state, and his smile widened, revealing a hint of the predator beneath the charm. a new arrival to our humble town, and in some distress it seems. He turned his attention to Jacob, his eyes hardening with contempt. And what have we here? The mountain trash has come down to scavenge, has it? Jacob met his gaze, his expression unreadable, his body perfectly still. He said nothing. Wheeler turned back to Sarah, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, solicitous tone. Miss Mitchell, a woman of your obvious quality, shouldn't be keeping such rough company. Perhaps you'd allow me to offer you my protection. I can arrange for a room, a decent meal, whatever you need. Copper Creek can be a harsh place for a woman alone. The offer was wrapped in the language of chivalry, but the meaning was clear. It was a proposition and a threat. Sarah, though weakened and afraid, still possessed a core of steel. Thank you, Mr. Wheeler, but I am not alone. Mr. Whitmore has already been most kind. Wheeler's smile tightened at the edges. His gaze shifted back to Jacob, and for a moment the charming facade dropped away, revealing something cold and obsessive. His focus was unnervingly intense, as if he were trying to see into Jacob's very soul. It was more than the simple arrogance of a wealthy man confronting a poor one. It was personal. Whitmore, Wheeler said, tasting the name with disdain. I've heard of you. The hermit who lives up in Paradise Valley. Tell me, what business could a man who despises civilization have with a lady in need of it? The lady and I are having our supper, Jacob said, his voice still quiet, but with an underlying edge of granite. And you're interrupting. For a heartbeat, the air crackled with tension. Wheeler was not used to being challenged. His hand twitched as if reaching for a weapon he wasn't wearing. Then he laughed, a short, sharp bark devoid of humor. Very well, he said, his eyes still locked on Jacob. Have your meal. But Miss Mitchell, my offer stands. When you find that the charity of savages runs dry, you know where to find me. He gave Sarah a final lingering look, then turned and strode to the bar, leaving a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the winter outside. The encounter had changed everything. The obstacle was no longer Sarah's hunger or Jacob's isolation. It was Marcus Wheeler. Jacob knew the type. A man who saw the world as a collection of things to be owned, and who would crush anyone who stood in his way. And for some reason, he couldn't yet fathom, Wheeler's gaze had lingered on him with a disturbing predatory focus, as if he recognized something he both hated and desired to destroy. The fight for Sarah's survival had just become a war for her soul. The storm hit just before dawn, a howling blizzard that descended from the mountains and smothered Copper Creek in a blanket of white. It was a prison of snow and wind, sealing the roads and trapping everyone where they stood. At the Golden Creek Inn, Jacob watched the world disappear behind a swirling curtain, his plans for a swift departure buried under 3 feet of snow. He was stranded with Sarah and with the shadow of Marcus Wheeler hanging over the town. The inn became a small, self-contained world, a refuge for the handful of travelers caught by the storm. For the next 3 days, as the wind screamed and the snow piled in drifts against the windows, an unlikely community formed around the hearth. Jacob, accustomed to a solitary existence, found himself slowly, reluctantly drawn into its orbit. It was Sarah who orchestrated this transformation. She emerged from the shell of her grief and humiliation, revealing a quiet strength and a natural gift for compassion. She organized games for the stranded children of a homesteader family, her laughter filling the common room. She read to an elderly preacher, whose eyes were failing her voice a soothing balm against the storm's fury. She helped Martha in the kitchen, her competence and grace turning chores into acts of fellowship. Jacob watched her fascinated. The desperate woman he had found behind the saloon was gone. In her place was a woman of substance, intelligence, and a deep, intuitive kindness. He found himself seeking her out, their conversations becoming the anchor of his long, snowbound days. He began to teach her small lessons in the art of survival that was his life's work. He showed her how to read the patterns of the storm in the shape of the snowdrifts, how to tie knots that would hold against any strain. He took out his father's leather-bound journal, its pages filled with sketches of medicinal plants and notes on animal behavior, and explained its contents. "My father believed a man should be able to stand on his own," Jacob explained one evening, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the journal's worn pages. "He taught me that the wilderness provides everything you need if you know how to look." Sarah traced a drawing of a yarrow plant with her finger. "My mother taught me the same thing in her own way. She said a woman should be able to stand on her own husband or no husband. She taught me languages and music so I would always have a way to make a living." She smiled sadly. "I just never expected to have to prove it so dramatically." Their bond deepened in these quiet moments, forged not in grand pronouncements, but in shared vulnerabilities and a growing, unspoken respect. Jacob felt the frozen fortress around his heart begin to thaw, the ice cracked by the warmth of her presence. He told her about his wife Eleanor and their daughter Lily, speaking of them for the first time in 15 years, not as a source of pain, but as a cherished memory. Sarah, in turn, spoke of her parents, of a life filled with books and music that now seemed a world away. While Jacob taught Sarah about the wilderness, she began her own quiet investigation. She spoke with Clara, the young widow Wheeler had been harassing. Clara, feeling safe in the anonymity of the snowbound inn, told Sarah more. Wheeler hadn't just offered her marriage. He'd threatened her, suggesting her late husband's mining claim had legal problems that only a man of his influence could solve. "He makes it sound like he's helping," Clara whispered, her eyes wide with fear, "but it feels like he's tightening a noose." Sarah then sought out other women in the town, who were on their own, widows, spinsters, women whose husbands were away on long cattle drives. A pattern began to emerge. Wheeler's protection was always offered to those in vulnerable positions, and his methods were always just within the bounds of the law, a campaign of suggestion, innuendo, and financial pressure that left his victims with no legal recourse. Meanwhile, Sheriff Tom Bradley, a weary but decent man who had been observing the town's dynamics for years, began his own quiet inquiries. He had seen Wheeler's methods before. He'd long suspected the rancher of playing a deeper game, but without a formal complaint, his hands were tied. Now, hearing whispers of Sarah's conversations, he started looking into Wheeler's land acquisitions. He noticed a disturbing trend. Wheeler's ranch had a habit of expanding to absorb the properties of those who had recently suffered misfortune. On the fourth day, the storm broke. The sun emerged, glittering on a world of pristine, silent white. The trail to Jacob's cabin would soon be passable. The thought of leaving, of returning to his solitude, filled him with a profound and unfamiliar dread. "The trail will be clear by afternoon," he said to Sarah as they stood on the inn's porch, the air crisp and clean. "You must be anxious to get home?" She replied, her gaze fixed on the distant snow-capped peaks. "I was," he admitted, "but the silence I used to crave, I'm not sure it will feel the same." Before she could respond, Marcus Wheeler's sleigh, drawn by two magnificent black horses, pulled up in front of the inn. He stepped out dressed in a thick fur coat, his face a mask of false concern. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I was so worried for you during the storm. I trust you were well cared for." His eyes flickered toward Jacob, a silent insult. "I was, thank you," Sarah said, her tone cold. "Now that the roads are clearing," Wheeler continued, "I must insist you allow me to escort you back to my ranch. You can stay as my guest until you decide on your future. It's not proper for you to remain here under the influence of this man." He gestured toward Jacob. He's heading back to his hovel in the mountains. He has nothing to offer you." "I'll be the judge of that," Jacob said, stepping forward. Wheeler ignored him, his focus entirely on Sarah. "Miss Mitchell, it's time to make a choice." "I have made my choice, Mr. Wheeler." Sarah said, her voice clear and strong. She looked at Jacob. "I'm going with him." A flash of disbelief, then pure fury crossed Wheeler's face. The charming facade shattered, revealing the raw, obsessive rage beneath. He took a step toward them, his body radiating menace. Two of his ranch hands, who had been waiting nearby, moved to flank him. "You don't know what you're doing." Wheeler snarled, his voice a low hiss. "You think you know this man. You think he's some noble savage." He laughed, a chilling, humorless sound. "You have no idea who he really is." He took another step, his eyes locked on Jacob, burning with a hatred that was years in the making. "I know you," he whispered, his voice shaking with a terrible, hidden grief. "I've been looking for you for a very long time." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper. He held it up for Sarah to see. It was a hand-drawn sketch, a wanted poster. The face was younger, harder, the eyes haunted by a desperate grief, but the resemblance was undeniable. It was Jacob. Beneath the drawing, 2 words were printed in stark, bold letters: Jake Thornton. "This man isn't Jacob Whitmore." Wheeler said, his voice rising to a triumphant roar. "His name is Jake Thornton, and 15 years ago in a bank in Denver, he held a pistol to my sister's head." The world seemed to stop. The air grew thin. Sarah stared at the sketch, and then at Jacob's pale, stricken face. The pieces clicked into place with sickening finality. Jacob's guarded past his flight to the mountains, his profound and abiding sorrow. My sister's name was Eleanor Wheeler, choked out tears of rage and grief streaming down his face. She was the teller at that bank. She was never the same after what he did to her. The terror he put in her eyes. It broke something inside her. She died 2 years later, a ghost of the girl she'd been. He jabbed a finger at Jacob, his whole body trembling. He killed her as surely as if he'd pulled the trigger that day. And I swore on her grave that I would find the man who did it and make him pay. He turned to Sarah, his expression a terrible mask of triumph and pain. My pursuit of you, Miss Mitchell, it was never about you. It was about him. I knew that a man hiding from his past couldn't resist playing the hero to a woman in distress. I used you to draw him out into the open. And now he smiled, a broken, terrible thing. I'm going to destroy him. The story had been rewritten. This was no longer a fight over a woman or a piece of land. It was a deeply personal vendetta, a story of revenge and grief that had been festering for 15 years. And Sarah found herself standing at the epicenter of 2 men's shared tragedy, her own fate inextricably tangled with a crime she had never known was committed. The revelation hung in the frozen air, as stark and brutal as the mountains that loomed over the town. Jacob stood as if turned to stone, the name Jake Thornton, stripping away 15 years of carefully constructed identity, leaving him exposed and raw. The ghost he had outrun for so long had finally caught him. Sarah stared at him, her mind reeling. The kind, gentle man who had shown her compassion, who had taught her to be strong, was a bank robber. The foundation of trust she had so carefully built with him crumbled into dust. And yet, looking at the profound agony etched on his face, she felt not revulsion, but a deep, aching pity. She saw not a criminal, but a man trapped by a single desperate moment from a lifetime ago. Wheeler, savoring his victory, gestured to Sheriff Bradley, who had been drawn out by the commotion. "Sheriff, I believe you have a fugitive in your custody." This man is wanted for armed robbery in the territory of Colorado. It is your duty to arrest him." Sheriff Bradley looked from Wheeler's triumphant face to Jacob's despairing one. He was a man who believed in the law, but he also believed in what he saw with his own eyes. He had seen Jacob Whitmore's quiet decency over the years. He had also seen Marcus Wheeler's manipulative cruelty. "Marcus, this is a serious accusation." Bradley said, his voice heavy. "It's not an accusation. It's a fact. Wheeler brandished the wanted poster. Are you going to do your duty, Sheriff, or are you going to let this animal escape justice again?" Reluctantly, Sheriff Bradley drew his pistol. "Jacob," he said, his voice filled with regret, "I have to take you in. Not for what Wheeler's accusing you of here and now, but for the Colorado warrant. The law is the law." Jacob didn't resist. He simply nodded, a weary resignation settling over him. He had known this day might come. In the deepest, darkest corners of his soul, he had been waiting for it. "Don't," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking, as Bradley produced a pair of iron handcuffs. Jacob looked at her. His eyes filled with a sorrow so profound, it stole her breath. "He's right, Sarah. It's the law. It's what I deserve." As Bradley fastened the cuffs around Jacob's wrists, the metallic click echoing the finality of a closing cell door, Sarah felt a surge of defiant anger. This was not justice. This was vengeance, orchestrated by a man twisted by his own grief. She would not let Wheeler win. She would not let him destroy the good man Jacob had become. "Sheriff," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound strength, "Mr. Wheeler claims Jacob kidnapped me. That is a lie. I came with him of my own free will as a partner to escape Mr. Wheeler's own unwanted and threatening advances." Wheeler scoffed, the desperate words of a compromised woman. "No one will believe you." "They will believe me." Sarah retorted, her gaze sweeping over the crowd of townspeople who had gathered. "They will believe Clara, the widow you threatened. They will believe the other women in this town you have intimidated. And they will believe the truth." She stepped forward until she was standing directly in front of Wheeler, close enough to see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "You think you've won, but all you've done is reveal who you truly are. A man who would use his own sister's memory to justify hurting innocent people. You're not seeking justice for Eleanor. You're seeking a balm for your own wounded pride." With Jacob now a prisoner, the nature of the obstacle had transformed. It was no longer a physical threat, but a legal battle against a powerful, influential man. Jacob was shackled, facing a hanging judge for a 15-year-old crime. The fight for his life, for their future, now rested entirely on Sarah's shoulders. She had to race against time. The territorial judge was known to be swift and harsh. Sarah had to prove not only that Jacob was a redeemed man, but that the entire case against him was a malicious fabrication born of Wheeler's vendetta. Her only weapons were the truth and the trust she had painstakingly built with the forgotten people of Copper Creek. She turned to Sheriff Bradley as he led Jacob toward the jail. "Sheriff, I will be bringing you formal complaints against Marcus Wheeler for intimidation and witness tampering. And I will be gathering testimonials on behalf of Jacob Whitmore. I ask that you hold him here in your jail until the judge arrives. Give me time to build his defense." Bradley looked at the determined set of her jaw, at the fire in her eyes, and nodded slowly. "I can hold him for a few weeks while I investigate your claims. But Sarah, you're taking on a powerful man. Be careful." As Jacob was led away, he looked back at her one last time. In his eyes, she saw not defeat, but a flicker of hope, a hope she had placed there. She knew what she had to do. She had to become the hero of this story. She had to navigate the town's treacherous legal and social currents, convince the women Wheeler had victimized to risk everything by speaking out, and gather testimony from the mountain folk who knew the truth of Jacob's character. She was alone, outmatched, and fighting for a man the world had already condemned. The race for Jacob's redemption had begun. The courtroom was a cavern of rough-hewn timber and flickering lamplight, packed with the entire population of Copper Creek. Outside, a late spring storm, as violent and unpredictable as the proceedings within, raged against the small courthouse, rattling the windows and plunging the room into momentary darkness whenever lightning split the sky. The ticking of the large clock on the wall was a merciless metronome, counting down the minutes to the verdict. Judge Morrison, a man whose face seemed carved from the same granite as the mountains, presided over the trial with an iron will. On one side sat Marcus Wheeler and his high-priced lawyer, confident and composed. On the other, Sarah stood alone, her only allies, a small stack of handwritten letters and the truth. Jacob sat at the defendant's table, his face a stoic mask, but his eyes never left Sarah. The trial had been a brutal affair. Wheeler's lawyer, a slick talker from Helena, had masterfully painted Jacob as a lifelong criminal, a predator who had used Sarah's vulnerability for his own twisted ends. He presented the wanted poster, the bank affidavit, the irrefutable evidence of the crime committed by Jake Thornton. "The facts are not in dispute." The lawyer boomed, his voice echoing in the tense silence. "The man sitting before you is a fugitive from justice. Whatever good deeds he may have performed are nothing more than the calculated actions of a wolf in sheep's clothing designed to conceal his true nature." Now it was Sarah's turn. She had spent weeks tirelessly building her case. She presented the testimonials from Dr. Webb and Father Miguel, their words painting a picture of a man dedicated to selfless service. She called Clara and the other widows to the stand, their voices trembling but firm as they recounted Wheeler's systematic campaign of intimidation. The townspeople murmured their loyalties, shifting like the winds of the storm outside. Wheeler's lawyer, however, was ruthlessly effective. He cross-examined each of Sarah's witnesses, twisting their words, questioning their motives, and casting doubt on their testimony. He dismissed the widow's stories as the bitter ramblings of lonely women, and portrayed the character witnesses as fools duped by a clever charlatan. "Your Honor," he argued, "Mr. Wheeler's personal affairs, however distasteful some might find them, have no bearing on the fact that the defendant is a wanted bank robber." All seemed lost. The weight of Jacob's past was too heavy, the letter of the law too rigid. Sarah watched as the hope drained from Jacob's face, replaced by the weary resignation she had seen the day of his arrest. She had one last piece of evidence, a desperate gamble she had unearthed in her frantic search for the truth. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting through the oppressive atmosphere, "I have one final piece of evidence to present. It is a letter. It was written by Eleanor Wheeler just days before she died." A gasp went through the courtroom. Marcus Wheeler shot to his feet, his face ashen. "Objection. This is a private family matter. It has no relevance." On the contrary, Sarah said, her gaze locking with Wheeler's, "It is the most relevant thing in this entire trial. It speaks directly to the true tragedy at the heart of this case." Judge Morrison leaned forward, his interest piqued. "The court will see the letter, Miss Mitchell." Sarah walked slowly to the judge's bench and handed him the delicate faded pages. She had found it tucked away in the county archives, misfiled with old property deeds. It had been sent to a childhood friend, a confession and a cry for help. As Judge Morrison read, his stern expression shifted first to confusion, then to shock. The storm outside reached a crescendo, a blast of wind and rain lashing against the courthouse, as if nature itself were passing judgment. "This letter," the judge said, his voice heavy, paints a very different picture of Miss Wheeler's final days. He looked directly at Marcus Wheeler. "It seems your sister was not wasting away from trauma, Mr. Wheeler. She was being blackmailed." The secondary twist landed like a physical blow. Wheeler staggered back as if struck. According to this letter, the judge continued reading aloud. "A man named Baron Croft has discovered a secret from my past. He is using it to force my family to sell our land to him for a pittance. Marcus refuses to see the truth. He is so consumed with finding the man from the bank that he has made a deal with the devil himself. Croft has promised Marcus influence and power in this territory in exchange for our property and for Marcus's help in acquiring other strategic parcels in the valley." The truth, in all its ugly complexity, was finally revealed. Eleanor had not died from the trauma of the robbery. She had died under the pressure of blackmail from a powerful land baron, Baron Croft, the same man who had become Marcus Wheeler's benefactor. Wheeler, blinded by his grief and ambition, had made a deal with the very man who had tormented his sister. Framing Jacob was not just personal revenge. It was a business transaction, part of Croft's larger scheme to seize control of the entire valley, including the 40 acres of Paradise Valley registered under the name of Jacob Whitmore. Wheeler collapsed into his chair, a broken man, the entire foundation of his 15-year crusade revealed as a monstrous lie. He had not been avenging his sister. He had been serving her tormentor. The courtroom was in an uproar. The ticking of the clock was drowned out by shouts of outrage. The lights flickered and died, plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the strobing flashes of lightning. In the chaotic gloom, Jacob faced a moral choice. He could let the full truth destroy Wheeler, exposing him as a pawn in the scheme that likely led to his sister's death. It would be a just and fitting end. Or he could protect the memory of Eleanor, the young woman he had inadvertently harmed so many years ago. He could spare her brother the final soul-crushing knowledge that his actions had been not only misguided, but a betrayal of the very person he claimed to be avenging. He stood up, his voice cutting through the noise. "Your Honor," he said, his words directed not at the judge, but at the shattered man across the aisle. Whatever deals Mr. Wheeler made, he made them out of a brother's grief. He was wrong, but he loved his sister. It was an act of profound and unexpected grace. In the moment of his own potential vindication, Jacob chose mercy, offering a sliver of dignity to the man who had tried to destroy him, and in doing so, finally truly balancing the scales. The storm passed, leaving the air clean and the world washed new. In the aftermath of the trial, Baron Croft's empire of intimidation began to crumble. With the evidence from Eleanor's letter and the testimony of the widows, federal marshals launched a full-scale investigation exposing a web of corruption that reached the highest levels of the territorial government. Marcus Wheeler was arrested not for his vendetta against Jacob, but for his complicity in Croft's conspiracy. His influence vanished overnight, leaving him a disgraced and broken man awaiting trial. Jacob, in light of the extenuating circumstances and the overwhelming testimonials to his character, was given a lenient sentence, the community service he had already been performing, to be completed under the supervision of his friend, Sheriff Bradley. He was a free man. A week later, Jacob stood outside the small cell where Wheeler was being held. Sarah stood beside him, her hand resting in his. The meeting was Jacob's idea. He needed one final act of closure. Wheeler sat on his cot, staring at the stone floor. He looked years older, the fire of his ambition and hatred extinguished, leaving only hollow embers of regret. "I didn't know," Wheeler whispered, not looking up. "About Croft, about what he was doing to her. I thought it was you. All these years I needed it to be you." "Grief can twist a man's soul," Jacob said quietly. There was no pity in his voice, but no triumph either. Only a deep, weary understanding. It can make you see villains where there are only other broken people. It almost twisted mine. She looked up to me. Wheeler said, his voice cracking, "I was supposed to protect her." "You still can," Jacob said. "By telling the truth at your trial, by making sure Croft pays for what he did to her. Do for her now what you couldn't do then." Wheeler finally looked up, his eyes meeting Jacob's. For a long moment, there was a silent acknowledgement between them, two men whose lives had been irrevocably shaped by the same tragedy, who had walked different paths of pain and retribution. There was no forgiveness, not yet. But there was a sliver of shared humanity, a recognition that the line between hero and villain is sometimes drawn by nothing more than the choices one makes in the face of unbearable loss. As they left the jail, stepping into the bright sunlight, Sarah squeezed Jacob's hand. "Are you all right?" "I am now," he said. "The past is finally where it belongs." They decided to stay in Copper Creek through the summer to help the community heal from the wounds that Croft and Wheeler had inflicted. Jacob worked alongside the men, whose trust he had earned rebuilding not just fences and barns, but the very fabric of the town. Sarah organized a proper school in the church basement, teaching the children to read and write, her classroom a beacon of hope for a town redefining itself. They were no longer outsiders. They were pillars of a community they had helped to save. They were building a new life, not on the ashes of the past, but on a foundation of redemption, forgiveness, and the quiet, steady strength of their love. They had faced the worst of themselves and each other, and had chosen to build something better. Their future, once a distant, uncertain horizon, was now as clear and bright as a Montana summer morning. Months later, as the first touch of autumn painted the aspen leaves in strokes of gold, Jacob and Sarah made a journey. They rode south for 2 weeks, leaving the familiar peaks of Montana behind and crossing into the rolling plains of Colorado. Their destination was a place that existed only in Jacob's memory, the ruins of his old farm and the place where his first life had ended. When they arrived, there was little left. The farmhouse was a skeletal ruin of blackened timbers, the barn a collapsed heap. But the land itself endured. The valley was just as he remembered, a quilt of green and gold under an endless blue sky. And on a small hill overlooking it, all beneath the shade of 2 ancient cottonwood trees, were 2 small weathered wooden crosses. Jacob dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He carried with him 2 objects. In one hand he held his father's worn leather journal, the book that represented his past, his survival, and the weight of his family's legacy. In the other he held a small tarnished gold band, Eleanor's wedding ring, which he had carried like a penance for 15 years, a constant physical reminder of his guilt. Sarah waited by the horses, giving him the space he needed. She watched as he knelt between the 2 small graves. He stayed there for a long time, his head bowed, the silence of the valley broken only by the whisper of the wind through the tall grass. He wasn't praying. He was speaking to them, a quiet, final conversation with the ghosts who had haunted him for so long. Then, with a sense of ceremony, he dug a small hole in the earth between the graves of his wife and daughter. He placed his father's journal inside our first. Then he held the wedding ring in his palm one last time, the sun glinting off its surface, before gently setting it on top of the journal. He covered them with earth, his hands packing the soil firmly, creating a new unmarked grave for his past. It was not an act of forgetting. It was an act of acceptance. He was no longer Jake Thornton, the fugitive running from his sins. He was not just Jacob Whitmore, the hermit hiding from his grief. He was both. He was a man who had integrated the broken pieces of his life into a new, stronger whole. He finally understood that the past was not a thing to be outrun, but a foundation upon which a new life could be built. He stood up, his shoulders straighter, the haunted look in his eyes replaced by a deep and abiding peace. He walked back to Sarah, his face serene. He took her hands in his. "It's done," he said. "I know," she replied, her eyes shining with love and understanding. As they prepared to leave to ride back north toward the mountains and the future they would build together, Sarah turned to him, a soft, secretive smile playing on her lips. "Jacob," she said, placing his hand gently on her abdomen, "there's something you should know. It seems our family is about to get a little bigger." He stared at her, his mind slow to grasp the meaning of her words. Then his understanding dawned. A look of pure, unadulterated joy transformed his face. He let out a laugh, a sound so full of life and happiness that it seemed to make the entire valley brighter. He swept her into his arms, lifting her off the ground and spinning her around, their laughter echoing in the quiet air. This was not just a happy ending. It was a new beginning, a symbol of new life, born not from tragedy, but from redemption. It was the true start of their family, a testament to the enduring power of love to heal the deepest of wounds. They mounted their horses and turned them toward the distant, hazy peaks of Montana. They rode away from the ghosts of Colorado, their past finally at peace, their future as clear and boundless as the sky above.